They called her the Ghost Omega. It was not a title of reverence. It was a brand of invisibility, a whispered curse that followed her through the cold stone halls of the Blackwood Pack. Alara was a phantom in her own life, a flicker of movement in the periphery, her presence tolerated only for the work her hands could do. The cold was a constant companion. It seeped through the worn leather of her boots and the threadbare wool of her tunic. It lived in the marrow of her bones, a deep, persistent ache that never quite faded, even in the height of summer. Now, with winter's first true blizzard howling outside, the cold was a predator. Her fingers were raw, the skin split and bleeding over her knuckles. The lye soap in the bucket of icy water was a special kind of torment, a fire that devoured her flesh with every dip and scrub. She was on her knees in the great hall, tasked with scouring the flagstones until they shone, a pointless endeavor when they were already tracked with mud and snow from the guards. No one else was given this task, not in this weather, but Lyra had insisted. Lyra, the Pack Alpha's daughter, with her glossy black hair and eyes the color of chips of ice. Her cruelty was a casual thing, a sport. She had found Alara huddled near the kitchens, trying to absorb a sliver of warmth from the ovens, and had smiled a thin, sharp smile, the smile that always meant pain was coming. "The Alpha King's envoy arrives in 2 days," Lyra had announced, her voice carrying so everyone could hear. "The hall is a disgrace. The Omega will clean it." She had emphasized the word Omega with a sneer, stripping Alara of her name and leaving her with only her worthless rank. An Omega with no family, no connections, an orphan taken in out of a pity that had long since curdled into resentment. She was a drain, a mouth to feed that offered nothing in return but menial labor. So now she scrubbed. Each push of the brush across the stone was a protest, a small, futile rebellion that only she would ever know. The wind screamed outside, a tormented beast clawing at the thick castle walls. It sounded the way her own soul felt, trapped and howling into a void. She remembered warmth once, faint, hazy memories of a mother's arms, of a scent like summer meadows and baked bread, a father's deep laugh. But those memories were like pressed flowers, fragile and faded, the color and life long gone. They had died in a rogue attack years ago, leaving her stranded, a piece of driftwood washed up on the hostile shores of the Blackwood Pack. She was worthless. The word was a drumbeat in her mind, a rhythm set by years of scornful looks and harsh words. Worthless, useless, ghost. A heavy boot kicked the side of her bucket, sloshing the freezing, caustic water over her legs. The soaked wool clung to her skin, instantly stealing what little warmth she possessed. A gasp of pain and shock escaped her lips before she could swallow it. "Watch what you're doing, filth!" a voice snarled. She looked up. It was Marcus, one of Lyra's favored suitors, his face twisted in a mask of contempt. He loomed over her, broad and menacing, enjoying the sight of her shivering on the floor. "You splashed my boots." I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice cracking from the cold and disuse. She rarely spoke. It was safer not to. He scoffed. "Sorry is not good enough." He nudged her shoulder with the toe of his boot, a deliberately degrading gesture. "Clean them." Humiliation burned hotter than the lie. It was a searing wave that washed over her, so potent it almost made her forget the cold. To kneel before him, to wipe the dirt from his boots like the lowest servant. It was another piece of her chipped away. She squeezed her eyes shut, her jaw clenched so tight her teeth ached. She would not cry. She had learned long ago that tears only invited more cruelty. They saw it as weakness, and they fed on weakness like wolves on a dying fawn. So she gritted her teeth. She held the scream of pure, undiluted rage behind them. She reached for the driest corner of her rag, her movements stiff and wooden. This was her life, a series of humiliations strung together by the endless, biting cold. But as her trembling, raw fingers reached for his boot, a flicker of something else sparked within her. It was not hope. Hope was a dangerous luxury she could not afford. It was something harder, something more stubborn. It was the refusal to break. They could take her warmth, her dignity, her name. They could work her until her bones ached and her fingers bled. But there was a tiny, indestructible kernel deep inside her that they could not touch. The part of her that still remembered sunlight. She would endure this. She would endure Marcus's sneer and Lyra's hatred. She would endure the cold and the hunger and the pain. She would survive. It was the only rebellion she had left. The storm worsened, growing from a howl to a deafening roar. The very stones of the keep seemed to vibrate with its fury. It was a monster of wind and ice, and it was swallowing the world. Ilara finished the floors, her body a single throbbing ache. She retreated to her designated space, a small, drafty alcove behind the laundry, little more than a closet with a pile of straw and a few thin blankets for a bed. It was her only sanctuary. Sleep offered no escape. It was filled with shivering and the gnawing emptiness in her stomach. She dreamed of fire, of a great roaring hearth that promised a warmth she could feel in her soul. But every time she reached for it, the flames dissolved into ice. The next day brought a new, impossible task. The blizzard had not broken, it had intensified. The world outside the narrow, arrow-slit window in the laundry was a churning vortex of white. Visibility was zero. The wind sliced like claws. Lyra found her sorting linens, her face alight with malicious glee. "The healer is out of Frostleaf," she said, her tone deceptively sweet. "Old Man Hemlock's cough is getting worse. Someone must go to the woods and gather more." Ilara stared at her. Go out in this? It was a death sentence. The frostleaf grew on the northern ridge, a treacherous climb even in good weather. In this blizzard, it was suicide. "No one can go out in this storm," Ilara said, her voice barely a whisper. It was the first time she had ever directly contradicted an order. Lyra's smile vanished. Her eyes went cold and hard. "Are you refusing a direct order, Omega? An order for the good of the pack?" The accusation hung in the air, heavy and dangerous. Refusing to help a sick elder was a serious offense. "It is not safe," Ilara repeated, a tremor in her voice. "Your safety is of no concern," Lyra snapped. "Your purpose is to serve. Now, you will take a basket and you will go to the northern ridge. Or you can be formally punished for insubordination. Perhaps a day in the ice cells would remind you of your place." The ice cells. A stone pit dug deep below the keep, open to the elements. No one survived a day in there during a blizzard. It was the same death sentence, just slower. Despair, cold and absolute, washed over her. She was trapped. Either way, she was being sent to die. A bitter, hollow feeling settled in her chest. At least in the woods, she would be free. Her last moments would not be in a cage, stared at by her tormentors. She bowed her head, the fight draining out of her. "I will go." Lyra's triumphant smirk was the last thing she saw as she turned away. They gave her a cloak, but it was old and patched, no match for the fury of the storm. The basket felt flimsy in her numb fingers. As she pushed open the heavy postern gate, the wind tore at her, a physical blow that staggered her and stole her breath. The world was white, a blinding, roaring chaos of snow and ice. The keep vanished behind her in 2 steps. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. She bent her head against the gale, pulling the thin hood over her face. The cold was immediate and shocking, a physical entity that sought to freeze the very air in her lungs. Every breath was a shard of glass. Why am I doing this? The question screamed in her mind. Why not just lie down and let it be over? But that stubborn kernel inside her refused. It forced one foot in front of the other. It was a stupid, pointless act of defiance. She would die out here, but she would die walking. She would die trying. The familiar path to the woods was gone, buried under massive drifts of snow. She navigated by instinct, by the vague shape of the trees that appeared and disappeared in the swirling maelstrom. The snow was thigh-deep in places, and each step was a monumental effort. Her body quickly began to fail. The shivering became uncontrollable, racking her frame. Her limbs grew heavy, numb. The cold was no longer just an ache, it was a crushing weight, a deep and spreading numbness that promised the false peace of sleep. She stumbled, falling face first into a deep drift. The snow was soft, almost welcoming. It packed against her face, stealing her breath. For a moment, she just lay there. It would be so easy to close her eyes, so easy to let go. No. The word was a silent roar in her soul. With a surge of desperate energy, she clawed her way back to her feet, gasping, her lungs burning. She could not see. She could not feel her hands or feet. She was lost. She staggered onward, directionless, driven only by a primal need to move. She was falling apart, piece by piece. The cold was winning. It was seeping past her skin, past her bones, into that final protected place inside her. It was freezing her will to live. Then the ground gave way. One moment she was on solid, snow-covered earth. The next, she was falling. A short, sharp drop. She landed hard on something solid, the impact jarring her teeth. Snow and ice collapsed around her, burying her. Panic, sharp and electrifying, cut through the encroaching numbness. She was trapped, buried alive. She flailed, pushing against the weight, but it was too heavy. The air was thick, suffocating. This is it, she thought, a strange calm settling over the panic. This is how it ends, buried in the snow, like a forgotten secret. Darkness bloomed at the edges of her vision. The roaring of the wind faded to a distant hum. Her struggles ceased. She was floating, drifting away on a cold, quiet tide. And then, a sound, a low growl close by. It was not the wind. It was deep, guttural, and full of pain. Through the crushing weight of snow, a sliver of light appeared. A dark shape was digging, moving with frantic energy. Claws and paws, not hands. A wolf, a massive one. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Rogues. She had fallen into a rogue's den. Her end would not be peaceful after all. It would be teeth and claws. The snow was cleared from her face. She stared up into the eyes of the largest wolf she had ever seen. Its fur was the color of shadow and silver, its shoulders broad and powerful, and its eyes burned with a fierce, desperate intelligence. One of its front legs was bent at an unnatural angle, dark blood staining the pristine snow around it. It was injured, trapped by the same storm. It looked at her, and it did not snarl. It whined, a low, painful sound. It was not a threat. It was a plea. The world tilted. The wolf's form seemed to shimmer, to stretch and twist. It was a blur of shadow and light, and then it was no longer a wolf. A man knelt where the beast had been. He was huge, a giant of a man whose sheer presence seemed to push back the storm. His shoulders were impossibly broad, draped in dark, rich furs that were caked with snow. His hair was a wild mane of black, shot through with silver, plastered to his forehead. His face was harsh, carved from granite, all sharp angles and predatory beauty. And his eyes, they were the same as the wolf's. Not merely intelligent, but ancient, powerful, and filled with an agony that stole her breath. They were the color of molten gold. He was a shifter. Not just any shifter. The power rolling off him in waves was immense, suffocating. It was primal and absolute. He was clearly in pain. His arm, now a man's arm, was twisted, the bone obviously broken. Yet he had used his last reserves of strength to dig her out. Why? He looked at her, his golden eyes wide with a mixture of agony and something else. Something that looked like disbelief, like wonder. He reached for her, his hand large enough to encircle her entire head. She flinched back, a purely instinctual reaction. He was a stranger, a terrifyingly powerful one, and she was trapped with him. His hand stopped, hovering in the air between them. A low sound, a rumble of distress, came from his chest. He was trying to shift back, she realized, but was too injured. He was stuck in his human form, vulnerable. The cold was returning, its victory imminent. Her vision was tunneling, the edges going dark. She was dying. Right here, in front of this impossible man. His gaze was locked on her face, intense, searching. His lips moved, forming a single, hoarse word that was lost in the wind. He had to know she was just an omega, worthless. He had wasted his strength on nothing. She felt a pang of regret, not for her own life, but for his. He had tried to save her, and in doing so, might have doomed himself. Her foolish, stubborn survival instinct had led her here, to be a burden on one last person. Her eyes began to close. The darkness was warm now, inviting. "No," he growled. The sound was deep as thunder, a command that vibrated through the very air. He crawled closer, ignoring the pain that contorted his features. He had to get her warm. He had to keep her alive. He reached for her again, his movements slow, deliberate, as if not to startle a fawn. Her mind screamed at her to scramble away, to run, but her body would not obey. It was a block of ice, unresponsive. All she could do was watch as his large, calloused hand came toward her face. The moment his fingers brushed her cheek, the world exploded. It was not a sound, it was a feeling, a cataclysm. Fire erupted from the point of contact, a searing, white-hot blaze that was not a burn. It was pure energy, pure life. It shot through her veins, a torrent of liquid lightning, chasing out the cold with brutal, shocking force. It lit up every nerve ending, every cell, making her gasp, her back arching in a spasm of overwhelming sensation. It was pain. It was pleasure. It was everything, all at once. A scream was torn from her throat, but it was lost in the greater sound of the bond slamming into place. It felt like a physical chain forging itself around her soul, linking her to him. On the back of her right wrist, a burning agony erupted. She twisted her head to look, and through the blur of tears and overwhelming sensation, she saw it. A mark was searing itself into her skin, glowing with an impossible silver and gold light. It was a stylized flame, intricate and beautiful and agonizing. The man jerked back as if he had been struck by lightning himself. He stared at his hand, then at her, his golden eyes blazing wider than she thought possible. The raw agony in them was gone, replaced by an expression of profound, earth-shattering shock. He saw the mark glowing on her wrist. He looked from it to her face, his expression shifting again, to awe, to reverence, to a certainty so absolute it was terrifying. "You," he breathed, his voice a raw, broken whisper of disbelief and homecoming. He said it not as a question, but as a final, undeniable truth. The end of a search she could not comprehend. He collapsed forward, the last of his strength giving out, his massive body shielding hers from the wind as unconsciousness finally claimed him. Alara lay there, pinned beneath his protective weight, her body thrumming with a terrifying new energy. The cold was gone, replaced by a fire that burned from the inside out. The mark on her wrist pulsed with a gentle warmth, a living thing now grafted to her flesh. Her mind was a whirlwind of confusion and fear. What was happening? Who was this man? What was this mark? Her instincts, however, were screaming something else, something her mind refused to accept. An ancient, primal part of her, newly awakened, recognized him. It knew him, and it was terrified of losing him. He was unconscious, severely injured, and the storm still raged. She had been saved from the cold only to be trapped in a new crisis. She looked at his broken arm, at the pallor beneath his tanned skin. He saved me, she thought. Now I have to save him. She did not know his name. She did not know what he was beyond a shifter of immense power. But she knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, that if he died, a part of her would die with him. The bond, this terrifying, painful, brilliant thing, had tethered her life to his. She was no longer just the ghost Omega. She was something more, something marked. And she was terrified. With strength she did not know she possessed, she began to move. The fire in her veins gave her power. She managed to shift his weight enough to breathe, to assess their situation. They were in a shallow ravine, a natural depression that offered some meager shelter from the worst of the wind. It was not enough. His breathing was shallow. He was losing too much heat. She looked at his arm. The break was bad, the bone pushing against the skin. She had seen injuries like it before on pack warriors. It needed to be set, and soon. But she was no healer. What could she do? Panic began to claw at her again. She was useless, a worthless Omega who scrubbed floors. She had no skills, no knowledge. He had saved her for nothing. Stop it. The voice in her head was sharp, unfamiliar. It was not her usual whisper of self-doubt. It was strong, commanding. She looked at her hands. They were no longer raw and bleeding. The lie burns were gone. The skin was smooth, whole. The fire of the bond had healed her. Could she? Hesitantly, she reached out and placed her hand on his uninjured arm. The contact sent another jolt of energy through her, warm and pleasant this time, a gentle hum instead of a violent explosion. She felt him. Not just the physical reality of him, but his presence, his life force, flickering and weak. She focused on the fire inside her, the new, strange warmth. She pushed it, willing it down her arm, into her hand, and into him. She had no idea what she was doing, only that she had to try. A soft, golden light began to glow from her palm. It was faint at first, then grew stronger, sinking into his skin. She watched, breathless, as some of the color returned to his face. His breathing deepened, steadied. It was working. She was helping him, healing him. The discovery was so profound it made her dizzy. She, Alara, the worthless ghost, had power. A power to give warmth, a power to give life. Renewed by a desperate, fragile hope, she turned her attention to his broken arm. This would be harder. She took a deep breath, gritted her teeth, and placed one hand above the break and one below. She closed her eyes, picturing the bone, shattered and misaligned. She pictured it whole. She pushed her newfound energy toward the injury, a flood of golden light. He groaned in his unconsciousness, his body tensing. She felt the bones shift under her hands, grating against each other. It was a sickening feeling, but she held on, pouring more and more of the light into the wound. She felt the moment the bones slotted back into place. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and she slumped against him, her energy utterly spent. The golden light faded. She was exhausted, but she had done it. The arm was set. It would still need to heal, but it was no longer a life-threatening injury. They survived the rest of the storm, huddled together in the ravine. Alara kept a steady, tiny trickle of her strange new warmth flowing into him, just enough to keep the deadly cold at bay. She drifted in and out of a shallow, exhausted sleep, her head resting on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. It was the most comforting sound she had ever known. When the blizzard finally broke, the world was silent, draped in a thick blanket of pristine white. The sun was a pale, watery disk in the sky. The man stirred. His golden eyes fluttered open, no longer clouded with pain. They were sharp, intelligent, and focused entirely on her. He sat up slowly, testing his arm, his expression one of faint surprise as he found it splinted and bound with strips she had torn from her own tunic. He looked at her, and the intensity in his gaze made her want to shrink away. "You healed me," he said. His voice was a deep baritone, a rumbling sound that vibrated in her chest. She just nodded, unable to speak. "You're her," he said, his voice soft with wonder. "My mate. I have been searching for centuries." Centuries. The word barely registered. Mate. That word landed like a physical blow. Her. The ghost Omega. Mate to this ancient, powerful being. It was impossible. A mistake. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. I'm no one. Just an Omega." His expression hardened, not with anger at her, but at the words she used to describe herself. "You are not just an Omega," he said, his voice dropping, possessive and absolute. "You are Luna. You are mine." He reached out, his fingers gently tracing the glowing mark on her wrist. This mark has not appeared in 1,000 years. It is the sign of the soul bond, the truest of all connections. She stared at him, her heart hammering. He believed it. He truly believed she was his queen. A desperate, terrifying hope began to bloom in her chest, a flower of impossible color in the bleak winter of her life. Could it be true? Could she really be more than what they had always told her she was? "My name is Kaelin," he said softly. "I am the Alpha King of all the Northern Packs." The Alpha King. Not an envoy, the king himself, the one Lyra was so desperate to impress. Alara felt a wave of hysterical laughter bubble in her throat. The irony was so thick she could choke on it. "We must get you back to my keep," Kalen said, his voice turning practical. He stood, his massive frame seeming to block out the sun. He was still stiff, but his strength was clearly returning at a supernatural rate. "You are not safe here." He was right. If the Blackwood Pack found her with him, if Lyra found out, she couldn't even imagine the consequences. But leaving was just as terrifying. It meant accepting this impossible new reality. It meant trusting this man who looked at her as if she were a goddess, not a ghost. Before she could protest, he swept her up into his arms as if she weighed nothing. Her head spun. She was cradled against his broad, warm chest, surrounded by the scent of pine, winter storms, and something else, something uniquely him. It was the safest she had ever felt in her entire life. "Hold on," he said, his voice a soft rumble against her ear, and then he began to run. He moved with a supernatural speed, his long legs devouring the deep snow. The world became a blur of white and gray. She buried her face in his furs, overwhelmed, terrified, and clinging to the fragile hope that this was not a dream. His keep was a fortress carved into the heart of a mountain, a place of breathtaking scale and power. It made the Blackwood Keep look like a child's toy. Guards with eyes of silver and gold bowed as he passed, their gazes flicking to her with open curiosity and shock before they schooled their features into neutrality. He did not take her to a guest room. He took her straight to the royal apartments, a sprawling suite of rooms decorated with rich furs, dark wood, and a roaring fireplace that seemed to call to her very soul. He set her down gently on a plush rug before the hearth. "Sit," he commanded softly. "You need to rest." She was too overwhelmed to argue. She sank onto the rug, her eyes wide, taking in the impossible luxury of her surroundings. He disappeared for a moment and returned with a tray of food: hot broth, fresh bread, roasted meat. The smell alone made her stomach ache with a hunger so deep it was painful. She ate like a starved animal, not caring how it looked. He watched her, his expression unreadable, a mixture of fierce protectiveness and a deep, profound sadness. "Who did this to you?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet, as he noticed the faded scars on her hands, the way she flinched when a log shifted in the fire. "Who made you believe you were worthless?" She couldn't answer. To speak of the Blackwood Pack, of Lyra and Marcus, felt like a betrayal, as twisted as that was. It had been her life, her prison. "It doesn't matter," he said, seeming to understand. "That life is over. You are home now." Home. The word was so foreign, so beautiful. She looked at him, at this powerful king who claimed her as his own, and for the first time in her life, she allowed herself to believe it might be true. The next few days passed in a blur of surreal comfort. She was given beautiful, warm clothes. She was fed until the gnawing hunger in her belly was a distant memory. Kalen was a constant presence, gentle but possessive. He never pushed her, never demanded anything, but his eyes followed her everywhere. He seemed content just to be in the same room as her. The bond between them was a living thing, a constant thrum of energy under her skin. She could feel his emotions, a deep, abiding loneliness that was slowly being replaced by a quiet joy. She could feel his strength, a mountain of it, and his fierce, unwavering focus on her. Her own power began to blossom in the safety of his presence. She found that the plants in her room grew faster, bloomed out of season. Small cuts and bruises she got from her own clumsiness would fade within minutes. The light inside her was growing, fed by the warmth and acceptance she had never known. But the ghosts of her past were not so easily banished. She still woke from nightmares of the cold. She still flinched from sudden movements. The words, worthless, omega, ghost, were carved so deeply into her that she feared they would never fade. One evening, as they sat before the fire, he took her hand and gently turned it over, his thumb stroking the soul mark. "It's beautiful," he murmured. "It's a brand," she whispered, the old self-doubt creeping in. "It marks me." "Yes," he said, his golden eyes meeting hers. "It marks you as mine, just as a matching mark will one day appear on me, marking me as yours. It is a mark of balance, of equals." Equals. The concept was so alien she could not grasp it. Meanwhile, back in the Blackwood Pack, Alara's disappearance had not gone unnoticed. At first, Lyra had celebrated. The ghost Omega was gone, likely frozen to death in the blizzard she had sent her into. It was a perfect, untraceable disposal. But then the rumors started. Whispers of the Alpha King finding his long-lost mate in the storm, a girl with no name, from a minor pack. The descriptions were vague, but they were enough to plant a seed of unease in Lyra's mind. Her unease turned to cold dread when one of the Blackwood warriors, who had been part of a patrol on the border, returned with a story. He had seen the Alpha King, Kaelin himself, carrying a woman. He had only caught a glimpse of her face, but he had seen the tattered gray cloak she wore, the same cloak Alara had been given. Lyra felt a surge of furious jealousy so potent it was nauseating. That thing? That worthless, sniveling Omega? The Alpha King's mate? The future Luna Queen? It was impossible. It was an insult. That destiny should have been hers. She stormed through the keep, her mind racing. She found Marcus, his ambition as sharp and ugly as her own. "The Omega is alive," she hissed, pulling him into an alcove. "The Alpha King has her. They say she is his mate." Marcus's eyes widened, first in disbelief, then in cunning. He had his own connections, his own dark allegiances. His family had long been in quiet correspondence with a rival faction, a group that called themselves the Ember Covenant. They were led by a shadowy, powerful alpha who sought to usurp Kaelin's throne. "His mate?" Marcus repeated, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. "A powerful king's only weakness." He saw it not as a story of destiny, but of opportunity. A low-born, unknown mate would be a source of instability, a perfect pawn. "Lord Vorlag will want to know of this," Marcus murmured, more to himself than to Lyra. "A mate he can control, or eliminate, would be the key to breaking Kaelin." Lyra didn't care about the politics. All she could see was Alara, wrapped in furs, sitting by a warm fire, living the life that should have been hers. "I want her back," Lyra snarled. "I want her to suffer for this." "Oh, she will," Marcus promised, his eyes gleaming with dark intent. "She will." The attack came without warning. Alara was in the castle's library, a vast circular room filled with the scent of old paper and leather. She was tracing the letters in a book with a sense of wonder, still marveling at being allowed to touch such treasures. Kaelin was in a council meeting, a fact his enemies had clearly known. The world shattered in a storm of black smoke and screaming. Shadowy figures materialized from the corners of the room, their forms indistinct, their eyes glowing with a malevolent red light. They were not shifters. They were something else, something steeped in dark magic. The Ember Covenant. Fear, cold and familiar, seized her. She was frozen, her mind flashing back to every moment of helplessness in her life. One of the figures lunged for her. Before it could touch her, Two of Kalen's personal guard, massive wolves with silver fur, materialized in front of her, snarling, their teeth bared. The fight was brutal and short. The shadow creatures were unnaturally strong, their claws dripping with a black substance that sizzled where it touched the stone. The guards fought valiantly, but they were outnumbered. One fell with a pained yelp, a deep gash in its side. The other was thrown against a bookshelf, collapsing in a heap. Alara screamed. A hand, cold as the grave, clamped over her mouth. Another arm, wrapped in black iron, encircled her waist, lifting her from her feet. She struggled, kicking and clawing, but it was like fighting against a statue. They were dragging her toward a swirling vortex of shadow that had opened in the center of the room. A portal. Through the bond, she felt a surge of pure, murderous rage from Kalen. He knew. He was coming. But he was too far. One of her captors held up a chain. It was made of dull, gray metal. Silver. As it neared her, the mark on her wrist flared with pain, a searing burn that made her cry out. The vibrant energy of the bond flickered, choked. The figure wrapped the silver chain around her wrists. The connection to Kalen, that constant warm hum, was severed. The silence was a physical blow, a sudden, horrifying emptiness that was worse than any pain. It was like having her soul carved out. The world went gray. The warmth inside her vanished. The cold was back, 1,000 times worse than before, because now she knew what she was missing. Despair, absolute and soul-crushing, claimed her. They dragged her limp body through the portal, and the library, her brief sanctuary, vanished. She awoke in a cell. It was dark, damp, and freezing. The silver chains bound her wrists to the wall, each link a point of agonizing, soul-dampening cold. The bond was gone. She couldn't feel Kalen. She couldn't feel anything but the gnawing emptiness and the bone-deep chill. She was a ghost again. No, this was worse. Before, she had been numb. Now, she was hollowed out. Days or hours passed. She lost track. Time was a meaningless river of misery. They gave her stale bread and brackish water, just enough to keep her alive. One day, the door creaked open, spilling dim torchlight into her cell. A man stood silhouetted in the doorway. He was tall and cloaked, his face hidden in shadow, but the aura of dark power that radiated from him was suffocating. It was a twisted, hungry version of Kalen's own authority. "The lost Luna," he said, his voice smooth and laced with venom. "You have caused a great deal of trouble." This was Lord Vorlag, the Shadow King. He stepped into the cell, his features becoming clear in the gloom. He was handsome in a cruel, sharp way, with eyes as black and empty as a starless night. "Kalen is tearing the North apart looking for you," he said, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "He is emotional, unfocused. It is disappointing, all for a little stray like you." He crouched in front of her, studying her with a cold, appraising gaze. "You are the key, you see. His soul is tied to yours. With you in my possession, I can bleed him dry. I can break his spirit. And then, his throne will be mine." He reached out, tracing a finger along her jaw. She flinched violently. His touch was frigid, dead. "Or perhaps," he continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "I could sever your bond to him and bind you to me instead. Imagine it. My power, joined with the soul of his mate, the ultimate victory." The thought was so vile, so repulsive, that it sparked something through the despair, a flicker of defiance. "Never," she rasped, her voice hoarse. Vorlag laughed, a dry, humorless sound. You have no choice. In 3 days, on the night of the twin moons, I will perform the ritual. Your bond with him will be shattered, and you will be mine." He stood and turned to leave. "Enjoy your last days of loyalty to a failing king." The door slammed shut, plunging her back into darkness and despair. His words echoed in the void. The bond would be shattered. She would be forcibly tied to this monster. It was a fate worse than death. She pulled at the silver chains, the metal biting into her skin, but it was useless. She was trapped, utterly and completely. She slumped against the wall, tears finally falling, freezing on her cheeks. Kaelin. His name was a silent prayer, a desperate cry into the emptiness. She tried to reach for the bond, for that connection, but there was only silence. The silver was a perfect prison. She closed her eyes, her spirit finally breaking. She had been a fool to hope, a fool to believe she could ever be anything more than a victim. Her life was a curse. Hold on. The voice was not in her ears. It was in her soul. A faint, distant whisper, struggling to break through the static of the silver. "Kaelin, I am coming." The voice was stronger now, filled with a promise of terrible retribution. "Just hold on. I feel you. Fight the silver." The connection was a thread, thin and fragile, but it was there. He was still connected to her. The silver dampened the bond, but it could not completely destroy it. A surge of desperate hope, fierce and wild, flooded through her. He was coming. He had not abandoned her. She had to fight. She focused all her will, all her being on that tiny thread. She poured her own essence into it, her fear, her hope, her love for this man she barely knew but was irrevocably a part of. She pushed back against the deadening effect of the silver. "I'm here," she sent back, a thought more than a word. "I'm waiting." The thread of their bond pulsed, strengthened by her response. She could feel his relief, his burning rage, his unwavering determination. It was enough. It was everything. She would not let Vorlag win. She would hold on. She would fight. The final day arrived. The air in the dungeon grew colder, charged with a palpable energy. She could hear chanting from somewhere above, the low, guttural sounds of dark magic. The ritual was beginning. 2 of Vorlag's shadow guards entered her cell. They unchained her from the wall, her wrists raw and bleeding, and hauled her to her feet. She did not fight them. She saved her strength. The thread of her bond with Kaelin was a humming wire in her soul, a conduit of shared resolve. They dragged her up winding stone stairs to a vast, cavernous chamber, a dark temple. At its center, a ritual circle was carved into the floor, glowing with a sickly red light. Lord Vorlag stood beside it, wearing ceremonial robes, his face alight with triumph. Lyra and Marcus were there, standing behind him, their expressions a mixture of awe and cruel satisfaction. "Bring her," Vorlag commanded. The guards forced her into the center of the circle. The moment she stepped inside, the red light flared, and invisible bonds wrapped around her, holding her immobile. The magic was cloying, suffocating, and it began to pull at the thread of her soul bond, trying to unravel it. Pain, sharp and excruciating, tore through her. It felt like she was being ripped in two. "The twin moons are at their zenith," Vorlag intoned, raising a black obsidian knife. "The bond will be severed. Her soul will be cleansed and rebound to me." He began to chant, the words alien and vile. The pressure on the bond intensified. The thread began to fray. Alara screamed, a raw, agonized sound. Through the bond, she felt a mirror of her pain in Kaelin, and a surge of his rage so powerful it was like a physical explosion. And then the entire fortress shook. A deafening roar, half man, half wolf, echoed from outside, a sound of pure, apocalyptic fury. A wall of the chamber exploded inward, showering the room with stone and ice. Kaelin stood in the breach, his human form wreathed in an aura of golden light, his eyes blazing like twin suns. Behind him were his warriors, a tide of silver and gold, their wolf forms massive and terrifying. Battle erupted. It was chaos, a whirlwind of claws and teeth, of golden light against red shadow. Vorlag's eyes widened in fury. "He's too late!" he shrieked, turning his attention back to Alara. He raised the obsidian knife. "The ritual is almost complete!" He plunged the knife down, not at her body, but at the air above her heart, at the spiritual center of the bond. Alara saw the blade descending in slow motion. She felt the bond screaming, about to snap. She saw Kaelin fighting his way toward her, his face a mask of desperation. But he was too far. He would not make it in time. And in that moment, something inside her broke. Not her spirit, her cage. The years of pain, the humiliation, the cold, the despair, and the fierce, protective love she felt for Kaelin, it all coalesced into a single, incandescent point of pure rage. They had called her worthless. They had called her a ghost. They had tried to break her, to use her, to erase her. No. The word was a silent detonation in her soul. A wave of pure, brilliant white light erupted from her body. It was not the gentle, healing glow from before. This was the light of a supernova, an explosion of raw, untamed power that vaporized the red circle, shattered her invisible bonds, and flung Lord Vorlag backward as if he were a rag doll. The light washed over the entire chamber. Kaelin's warriors, touched by it, felt their strength surge, their wounds closing. Vorlag's shadow creatures, however, dissolved into screaming smoke, their darkness unable to exist in her pure radiance. The room fell silent, bathed in her ethereal glow. Everyone, Kaelin, Vorlag, Lyra, Marcus, stared at her, their faces a mask of stunned disbelief. She stood in the center of the devastation, no longer a shivering, frightened girl. Her head was held high, her eyes blazing with white gold fire. The power thrumming through her was immense, ancient, and entirely her own. She was not a reflection of Kaelin's power. She was his equal, his other half. "You were wrong," she said, her voice ringing with an authority that shook the very stones. She looked directly at Vorlag, who was struggling to his feet, his face burned and blistered by her light. "I am not a key. I am not a pawn." She took a step toward him. "And I am not worthless." Vorlag snarled, raising his hands to summon another wave of shadow. "I am the Luna Queen," Alara declared, and as she spoke the words, she felt their absolute truth. She raised her own hand, and a beam of solid, searing light shot from her palm, striking him square in the chest. He screamed, a high, thin sound, as the light consumed him, burning away his darkness, his power, his very existence. In a flash of blinding intensity, he was gone. Only a pile of black ash remained. The light around her softened, receding back into her until it was just a gentle aura. The chamber was still. The battle was over. She turned, and her eyes met Kaelin's. He was looking at her with an expression of such profound love, awe, and pride that it made her heart ache. He walked toward her, his step slow, reverent. The space between them crackled with energy. He stopped just before her, raising his hand to cup her face, his touch as gentle as it had been in the snow. "My queen," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. She leaned into his touch, a sob of relief and release shaking her frame. "Kaelin." He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against his chest. She buried her face in his shoulder, breathing in his scent, feeling the steady, powerful beat of his heart. The bond between them flared to life, no longer a fragile thread, but a blazing sun, whole and stronger than ever before. "I have you," he murmured into her hair. "I have you." From across the ruined chamber, Lyra stared, her face pale with shock and terror. She saw the way the Alpha King looked at Alara, the power Alara now wielded. She had not tried to kill a ghost. She had tried to cage a goddess. Her and Marcus, who was cowering behind a fallen pillar, were utterly, hopelessly doomed. Alara felt a final, profound shift within the bond. As Kaelin held her, claiming her, she instinctively pushed back, not with defiance, but with acceptance, with love. She claimed him in return. He let out a sharp gasp, his hand flying to his own wrist. She pulled back slightly to see. There, burning itself onto his skin, was a mark that mirrored her own, a soul mark of silver and gold, branding him as hers. The bond was complete, balanced. He looked at the mark, then back at her, a slow, radiant smile spreading across his face. It was like watching the sunrise after a long, dark night. "Mine," he said, his voice soft. "Mine," she answered, her own voice clear and strong. He led her from the ruins of Vorlag's fortress, out into the clean, cold air of the mountains. His people were waiting. They parted for them, their heads bowed, their eyes filled not with pity or scorn, but with reverence. They were not looking at a ghost Omega. They were looking at their queen. Days later, standing on a high balcony of the mountain keep, draped in furs of white and silver, Alara looked out over the vast, snow-covered kingdom that was now her home. Kaelin stood behind her, his arms wrapped around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. The cold of the wind no longer bothered her. A permanent warmth resided in her now, a fire that could never be extinguished. He had presented her to his people not as a prize he had won, but as the partner he had found. His Luna, his queen. Alara the Lightbringer. She was no longer invisible. She was seen. She was no longer worthless. She was cherished. She was no longer alone. She was part of a pack, a family, a soul. She turned in his arms, her hand coming up to rest over his heart. She could feel its steady rhythm, a mirror of her own. She looked into his molten gold eyes, eyes that had seen centuries of loneliness, and saw only her own reflection. The scars on her soul were still there, faint and faded, but they no longer defined her. They were just a reminder of the journey, of the cold she had survived to find this impossible warmth. "I love you," she whispered, the words feeling as true and natural as breathing. Kaelin's smile was her answer. He lowered his head and kissed her, a kiss that was not about possession or destiny, but about choice. About two souls, once lost and broken, finally finding their way home to each other. In the heart of the Winter Kingdom, the ghost Omega was gone, and a queen had risen from the ashes, her light a beacon for all to see. She had found her place, her power, and her king. She was home.